I am very careful to kind of use the simplest ways of explaining and the most inviting forms of understanding it, so that people don't just, take one look at it or hear one part of my lecture and just run off, because they're intimidated and think that they're not smart enough to understand what I'm talking about. That's why I'm trying to keep it very common sense, very practical, very easily accessible. So this next part here, then we get into deductive and inductive reasoning. And in class I posted that nice graph that really breaks down inductive and deductive reasoning. Because if you notice in even in the curriculum what I quoted from the Wikipedia page on deductive and inductive reasoning, that it's really, they try to make it into another dichotomy. That it's not something that, as it explains in the graph, inductive and deductive reasoning should be used to complement one another and come up with a cogent theory based on both of them and a lack of contradiction between them, and that's a sound statement or thesis is something that is not contradicted by its inductive or deductive reasoning. But in the in the curriculum, in the Wikipedia page, it really tries to contrast them and not talk about how they work together, but to make it like it's a binary kind of either or choice system of you either use inductive reasoning or you use deductive reasoning. And so I really like this this graph that I posted, because it cuts through all that, and it explains in a fairly common sense way that you're using both, and it gets into the idea of the left and right brain thinking, and the idea that it's not left or right that you need to be using, it's both. It's, you need to be paying attention to details, and you need to be examining the larger patterns that those details are explaining and enumerating. So I think that this graph here, and I posted it in class, it's the one that says Logic, Non-Contradiction, Art of Thinking. And it comes from naturallawscience.org. And, it has a feedback arrow between induction and deduction. And then it has two boxes to the sides of that. And for induction, then it says enumerative, intuitive, dialectical. And then for deduction, it has identity, definition, syllogism. And for induction, it explains it, and it says terms and propositions from experience through conception. Reality is induced. Thoughts about what is in reality. Material of reasoning. So then deduction is consistency, harmony, and non-contradiction of thought, reasoning itself. So that's kind of, in the way that they're describing it here, it's kind of, induction then would be your senses, what you're taking in, uh, and the ground of grammar. And then deduction is more kind of logic, is the ground of reasoning itself. Not the ground, but the thing itself that grows out of the ground of grammar and observation. And I like that. It's a little complicated, but it kind of covers a good cross section of how this process works, and the kind of most simple way to break it down without adding a lot of other kind of, fancy terminology and just making it into something it's not. Because what we're talking about is something that the smallest child does with no schooling whatsoever. Children, infants know what their mother's voice sounds like, what their mother's breast is. They they don't have much motor control, but they sure like their hands, and they know that that's their hand, Probably they don't call it that, but they understand that it's their limb, that it's connected to them, and it's part of them, and these things are very simple. The law of identity, A is A, is really pretty simple, and that these things are simple, and that's why I think that this should really be taught throughout school in varying degrees of complexity, so that as children you're basically introduced to this idea and given kind of more along the lines of what I'm teaching in this class, a very basic introduction to reasoning, to logic, to critical thinking. And then, as you progress, then you're given more advanced courses of study in this. And so at the bottom of this graph, it says, induction is like the extraction, abstraction of material in the parts. We distill from those parts a concentrate. That concentrate is a universal. Deduction takes those distilled, extracted bits, universals, and processes them to produce something else. The mind is the machinery that transforms natural products from induction into something else with deduction. I kind of like that part. It's my least favorite part of all of this. It's a little unclear, and it sort of gets into metaphysics. The metaphysical given, the axiomatic knowledge. And that's the reason I have that attitude about it. That I don't especially like that is because that's basically axiomatic and universal metaphysical givens are all basically ways of saying that there is certain things that are just self-evident that do not need to be explained or evidence to be described for. And in certain situations, I would say that's a valid claim. When you're actually learning about this, though, when you're learning how to think critically, relearning it and trying to unlearn, that very thing, which is accepting things uncritically, then I think it's important to not skip that step of the metaphysical given and the universals, because that is the very ground, the very basis for knowledge. And that's kind of what I was talking about with the whole vision quest thing I was talking about, is going out and getting out of your tribal culture to really get past all the things that your culture assumes are true and consider to be metaphysical givens, and going out and considering from your own perspective if that is in fact the case or not. And I really think that's key. So I really think that the basis for all this really needs to be beginning with metaphysical givens, and considering whether you find them to be accurate or true or correct. Right. And I will be right back. Okay, so I was talking about inductive and deductive reasoning, and logic and the Trivium method. So I have here in my notes, logic is the means through inductive and deductive reasoning of evaluating information in terms of the law of identity, A equals A, for both accuracy and objectivity. In terms of grammar, we are looking for bodies of evidence which support the claim that A is or is not A. So, now to get back to the curriculum, the next section is about confirmation bias. And confirmation bias relates to what I was just saying in terms of our own mental ability to trust our perception that A is in fact A or is not in fact A. Because we all have a tendency, as it says here, to search for, interpret, or recall information in a way that confirms our beliefs or hypotheses. If you're looking for certain results, then you're going to see them. And that gets back to what I said in the very first introductory lecture, that where Robert Anton Wilson is quoting Dr. Leonard Orr, and he says, what the thinker thinks, the prover proves. And this gets back into that idea of, what you think you will prove to be true. And gets us back into objectivity and subjectivity, and that idea of understanding what the difference is in your own mind between objectivity and subjectivity, and understanding how to distill and to separate the wheat from the chaff. And that it's really, there's a logical process for doing it to some extent, but it's really sort of an acquired skill that is could be referred to as an art form thinking. Because a person really needs to experience